So tonight, let's continue our exploration of the implications of the teachings of Sri Ramana. And in particular, let's look at the dimensions of existence that are referred to as the will to power, the famous phrase of Friedrich Nietzsche as the operating principle of subjectivity, the seductions of epistemophilia, which is a big word to refer to Melanie Klein's understanding of the ego in its healthier modes of growth and maturations, coming to love knowledge, epistemology, the study of the theory of knowledge. What does it mean to know? And the seductions of epistemophilia mean the ways in which knowledge can actually distract us from growth and maturation at a certain point, and cause our trajectory of development to become deviated from the optimal path. And then the politics of ontology. Ontology referring to the philosophical discipline that studies being, or the real, or just what is. And so Sri Ramana has given us very important insights and revelations about these 3 points that were not accessible to the West, for the simple reason that we did not have a living model that represented the highest levels of development of consciousness in the West, not for a long time. And here a living model of one who is victorious over all of the seductions and the entrapments of lower consciousness and the various wills that are not the true will of the real, of what is in the deepest sense of the source of our being. Ramana has revealed through his charitra, his actual life, and the performance of a victorious, liberated existence that overcame all of the seductions of comfort and of, let's say, any need for support or otherness or engagement with the world to be appreciated or recognized or known, or any of the, let's say, comforts of bodily existence and excess, let's say, that are the ego in its usual levels of development are prone to give in to at the price of self-sovereignty. Ramana was an example of one who did not compromise with let's say, the temptations to fall into an ordinary existence or into a life that settled for its phenomenal plane reach rather than its transcendental capabilities that would enable a power to move through one's life that the ego is incapable of gathering and using to maintain its strength and its clarity and its purity of being. So it's important to understand that Sri Ramana was literally dragged to Arunachala. He had no intention of going there. So in the case of Ramana, it's not a story about the will to power, but the will of power. the supreme power willed him to come to the holy mountain and to be the mouthpiece and the living performativity model of liberated reality and existence, and the human expression of the significance of Arunachala. Achala meaning the immovable, unchangeable power of being, and Aruna meaning the light, the luminous radiance of the Supreme Presence that comes through that unmoving power. So Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Ramana, Arunachala as the archetype that became materialized in a living form as well as in the form of a mountain and in the form of a consciousness who is able to sustain the supreme level and vibrational frequency of God that is the rarest achievement possible, the highest, the rarest, the most precious achievement possible, and was proved to be possible. And it's this that Ramana enables us to claim as our own birthright, as our own possibility for our existence. So the will to power, as Nietzsche would interpret it, was not a will of an ego, but the will in almost a Schopenhauerian sense. If you remember Schopenhauer's book, The World as Will and Idea, the idea in Schopenhauer's understanding was that there's a blind will to life and to the development of all the potentialities of life that moves through one and creates drives and affects that overpower the consciousness of the ego and inflect one's life toward the fulfillment of intentions that are not the ego's own intentions. And Nietzsche, I think, carried that further and said it's not actually a blind will, it's a will that's very much guided toward the unfoldment of all of those potentialities that are latent within each individual, but it's not based on an individual consciousness, but on the collective or the consciousness of the whole, of the ecosystem, of the cosmos, in fact. There's no limit because it comes from that source that is the source of reality itself. It's literally an ontological power. It's the power that is the manifestation of being that moves through each individual and actually choreographs the relationality of individuals in their complex interrelationships that they themselves do not understand, because the individual sees only one slice of itself at a time as it goes through the illusion of time and space. I think Nietzsche would have been comfortable with David Bohm's idea of the implicate order as underlying the explicate order of the phenomenal plane. But what I think Nietzsche did not get that Ramana did reveal is the non-duality of the implicate order and the explicate order. The two are not two, they are one. And so although the consciousness of the ego going through time does not understand its future state of being once it has transcended its own egoic limitations and the pathologies of the conditionings of the ego, and has healed itself and released itself of those structural impediments of the increase of consciousness. Once the ego mind has died, then the entirety of its presence as the implicate order that's timeless, can see itself, can know itself. And this is what the meaning of the term Maharshi or Maharishi is. What did Ramana see? Maharishi means the great seer. He saw through his own death his eternal presence and his nature as the implicate order of reality as a whole, not as some individual, but literally the self, writ large, as that cosmic consciousness expressing itself in the final apocalyptic revelation of the truth of the nature of reality on this phenomenal plane as the expression of the noumenal, of God consciousness. And so that was what he not only was able to see, but to become, to realize, to sustain in his life. Many people have glimpses of this, but how many hold it? How many sustain it? How many live it and never lose it? It's this that separates Ramana from all the rest of the human species in that sense. One moment of that revelation and the going through ego death, and the ego never returned. He did not allow it to return. He remained in that unmoving, unshakable presence that accepted the implicate order. And through the surrender of the will to power as an individual, the will of that supreme power moved through him and took over his life. And through being possessed by that power and with no residue or remainder of ego or of separate individuality, that power functioned without a glitch, without a distortion, without a deviation, and in its full capacity to express itself in multiple dimensions of understanding and of transmission. So Ramana gave through his life and through the teachings, an understanding of what power really is. Because although the postmodern ego is totally obsessed with power, it has no idea of what power really is, because it only has the most primitive fantasies of power that are based on popularity and fame and financial fortune and having a string of attractive sexual partners or some kind of special talent or something else that makes one stand out as a somebody. You know, it's that kind of a very infantile approach to what power is that is the vanity of a narcissistic ego and has nothing to do with real power. It's the breaking through of that level of the powerless ego with its insatiable desire for recognition and approval and domination over the other that is the gift that Ramana has given to us and to the world as an entirely new vision of what power really is. And this is the power of God literally moving through the individual and granting that eternal life and eternal love and eternal bliss that is the compensation for the price that one pays, which is the absolute renunciation of everything one thought one was and everything one thought one depended upon, including the body and its health and its comforts and its sense of relationality to biological family or social system or culture or religion or any of the other signifiers of identity that are actually the impediments to the attainment of real power. And so Ramana broke through all of those illusions, and this is where the seductions of epistemophilia stop most people, because in the growth and maturation of most egos who develop, at least within, let's say, the Western canon of symbolic development and philosophical understanding and scientific sophistication, etc. There is a power that is given by the insights of psychoanalysis and philosophy and science that can seduce one into believing that that symbolic sense of understanding is sufficient to grant one a sustainable sense of empowerment that gives one a ground on which to stand. But it turns out that knowledge on the phenomenal plane level is completely unstable. It's temporary. It suffers from the same flux of impermanence as do the forms of material entities themselves. And so we have witnessed, for example, an extraordinary shift in the understanding of the nature of reality from the beginning of the 20th century until now, that has shaken the very ground and roots of the Western understanding of what is. And this gets now into the politics of ontology, because I remember during most of the period in which I was going through formal education in universities, it was not only heretical, but it was ridiculed if one was anything but a hardcore materialist. And you couldn't get a job in most universities. And one of the reasons I didn't bother to go through the final formal study of psychology is it was all based on behaviorism and on the analysis of what you can do to rats' brains and rabbits' nictitating membranes in their eyes through conditioned reflex experimentation, and discover the neurological basis of consciousness that can then be metaphorically applied to human consciousness through the same kind of mind control techniques that the behaviorists have discovered are workable with other animal forms, and the complete reductionistic approach toward human life that lacks any spiritual dimension or any sense of morality or any sense of the development of consciousness beyond the reward system that can be offered to an ego to sustain its interest in accommodating the desires of the power that can inflict such an experiment to coerce the subjects of the experiment to adapt to the conditions of the environment that are created by the experimental laboratory technicians. And so there became this technical approach to the understanding of human psychology that, in a sense, affirmed the worst and the lowest levels of the potentialities of humanity in its inhumane desire to dominate over the consciousness of others, which is then enacted in the form of disinformation and in the form of all the various kinds of deceptiveness that we face in trying to gather credible information about the nature of reality. But there are, I think there were, until very recently, there was a lock on the chairmanships of all the various departments and pretty much all the leading universities, at least of the US and I think of Europe, in which there was maybe in some of the Ivy League schools one place for an idealist, as kind of a museum piece to look at this character here, who believes that there is mind rather than matter at the fundament of reality. But for the most part, they were there as a laughingstock for the materialists to make fun of, in the faculty lounge. And there was very little attention paid to the possibility that any other paradigm of reality was even worth considering. And then suddenly, the ground began to crumble away from materialism. And the clear evidence of quantum physics, the clear evidence that was coming through from various strands, including the Jung-Pauli conjecture based on synchronicity and the psychoidal nature of reality that quantum physics was delivering in alignment with psychology, at least of depth psychology, and the information and the let's say the transmission of new insights that were coming from the movement of the, let's say, psychedelic revolution and the taking of LSD and the various other mind-expanding chemicals that began to have differential effects upon the mind, producing vibrational frequencies not controllable by behavioristic means. And that led to an entirely different panorama of potentialities of consciousness, as well as that which was coming from Eastern metaphysics and the practice of meditation and yoga that was coming into the West. So an entirely new frame of reference was developing that has literally undermined materialism within almost the blink of an eye, and has led to a complete shakeup within the politics of the establishment, of the academies at least. It hasn't yet trickled down to the population at large. So I would say that what is still the main obstacle of most people to come to an ashram like this or to engage in a spiritual life with seriousness, not just dabbling in an occasional meditation retreat or let's say, an ayahuasca retreat in Peru or something like that, but a serious engagement with consciousness is the fear of madness and the fear of that other people will think you are mad. And it's that fear of becoming too different from the other members of your family and your social group and your church group and your professional colleagues and all of that, that they will all look at you like you are crazy, that prevents people from taking the leap into a paradigm that is ontologically forbidden territory if you want to be accepted into the frame of reference in which other people will be able to relate to you comfortably. And so you have to let go of and be completely disinterested in those kinds of relationships that depend upon your compromising your own identity and your own capacity for transcendence of the ego in order to fit in to those models of reality that inherently stunt your growth and keep you limited to a phenomenal plain slice of who you are rather than to the fullness of the implicate order of your essential nature that would be available to you, but at the price of being an outcast or a crucified victim of the social order's retaliation against one's daring to know too much and to go beyond the limits of what you're allowed to know and to see and to become. Even Ramana, in his establishment of the ashram, went way beyond the limits of what Hinduism allowed in his refusal to go along with all of the caste purity rules of the Brahmins and the food rules regarding the garlic and onion issue and all of the various other issues that you might think are petty and small, but to a Hindu fundamentalist are not that at all. And so it's Ramana's ability to be completely uncaring about the way that his political lack of correctness would be perceived, his complete freedom from the worry about the other's imaginary was astonishing in his ability to be completely free of any of the constraints of the social order. Or even of the constraints of the sadhu order and of the ways that one is supposed to become a sannyasi, a renunciate. So he even renounced the principles of renunciation and became much more radically free than those other beings who followed the rules even in their attempt to transcend the rules, and who followed only the spontaneous orders of the immovable presence of the Supreme Power. So Ramana gave us a new politics of ontological being, ontological presence, that reveals that supreme power is now moving through the world in a new way, and in the same way that it has crumbled the materialist paradigm forever. And you will see that that if you investigate what's happening within the let's say university institutions, that there's a total chaos. Literally, the system is breaking down into, it's not just at the edge of chaos. The system is well into a total chaotic decomposition that is creating new possibilities of integration of interdisciplinary understandings. And so it's a time in which new possibilities for the synthesis and the integration of let's say, fields of knowledge that had before not been allowed to be put together because of the political intentions to make sure that no one had an integral understanding of everything, so that everyone would have to simply follow the rules of what they need to know to fit into a particular discipline, and therefore not be able to make moral decisions about the overarching context in which, let's say, technological developments would take place. So in other words, they had to solve the problem of how do you get scientists like an Einstein, who are very humanitarian and who have a love of life and of art and of beauty and of goodness. How do you get them to create atomic bombs for you? How do you get them to create ICBMs? How do you get them to create surveillance systems and other forms of domination? You can only do that through this splitting off of the discipline from its own ethical foundations in human reality. And so that capacity now has been broken through. And so suddenly there are revolutionary developments of resistance to power and intentions of breaking free in order to speak truth to power. But there's also a lack of truth and a lack of the power to speak because we have lost and atrophied our capacity to be connected to the real power that has the capacity to overcome the will of the majoritarian system, let's say, even in its crumbling and in the death throes of its incoherence. There isn't a sufficient coherence of the self that can speak through a voice of truth that can inspire and open up the minds of those who have been broken apart into dissociated fragments of ego into an interiorized wholeness that can then move beyond the limitations of the social order or the other paradigms in which they have been entrapped, and to break free into liberated consciousness, as Ramana did. But that movement is underway, and it's that is the, let's say, miraculous and yet under the radar event that is rumbling through the world and bringing about an awakening, but a very creeping, slow awakening that is from the grassroots moving through human consciousness and through non-human consciousness as well. And I don't just mean lower non-human, but non-human of, let's say, interplanetary nature of beings who are forming part of the system of a new reality that is gradually coming into being, thanks to the, let's say, I think a lot of it should be owed to the developments of one of the great Western yogis, Nikola Tesla, and his discovery of scalar force, and that capacity for instantaneous, faster than light communication that even quantum physics is still suppressing, but that enabled an interplanetary communication to take place on, thanks to an experiment that Tesla accomplished without the help of a grant from any institution, and was able to bring about a, let's say, a meeting of minds that transcended that of the mere human level of consciousness that has consistently been developing in non-public forums of the consciousnesses who are freeing themselves from the fear of the, let's say, the xenophobia of the human egos being outmatched by levels of intelligence that it cannot keep up with, and that it must therefore return to and depend upon a power that transcends its own capacity for the understanding of the logic of the development of higher technology within this plane through the access of a power that transcends the mere technical and the mere phenomenal. And so it's this meeting that requires the divinization of human consciousness in order to provide a level playing field in which a meeting ground of let's say cosmic consciousnesses can regroup without the contamination by paranoia or by the conflict of egoic forms of separate identifications that are possibly in competition with one another or in relationships of subservience or domination. So this new frame of reference requires the transcendence of ego if we are to meet the challenge of this, this moment in history in which the entire provincial belief system of the human consciousness in its current form of understanding has to completely fall away in the presence of an awesome revelation of that which only a mind as large as that of Ramana Maharshi will be able to contain and to mobilize toward its actualization in the most beautiful form, in which both destruction and reabsorption into the unmanifest absolute and recreation of the cosmic dream can be contained within a presence and an intelligence and a luminous trans-individual, trans-cosmic consciousness can bring to birth spontaneously and effortlessly as simply a function of its own authorization by the Absolute. I think that's all I'm supposed to say tonight. So I'll open the floor, if any of this made sense to anyone. Mm-hmm.
I'm helping a young boy, 13 years old, with his English, and he talked to me about Tesla.
Tesla. Mm-hmm.
So I looked it up,
Mm-hmm.
and what I read too was that he supposedly was going mad in his little apartment.
Yeah, that's what they say.
Yeah, that's right. And most of his works were confiscated.
They were confiscated by the CIA. Yeah, that's right. And they're still not released. Sure. No, he was the greatest genius of the age. Produced everything, the electricity systems, everything is owed to him. But he discovered free energy, and the capitalists didn't like that, so they jettisoned him and took away his income, etc. But you know, he met Vivekananda, who was visiting the U.S., and Vivekananda explained to him Advaita Vedanta and all of that, and Tesla said, "Okay, I get it. That's what I'm developing myself all along. It's the same science, but I've been developing its technological applications." So they were clearly on the same stream of consciousness.
So, I'm curious, but you're saying that it's actually destroying the system, is this capacity to see everything and the connections and everything? And,
Mm-hmm.
and that's happening
Mm-hmm.
at all levels right now?
Mm-hmm. It's happening along with the resistance to it, but the resistance, because of its incoherence, actually accelerates the chaos. Because the more the system resists knowledge, the more it's unable to function, because it requires knowledge. You can't maintain a technological grid without people with a lot of knowledge and a lot of maturity and a lot of capacity to deal with stress, and who don't have attention deficit, who can stay focused, you know, when your nuclear reactor is having a meltdown, and know how to set it right again. And there are very few engineers capable of fulfilling the functions of sustaining a technological grid, let alone not just a technological grid, but a grid of, let's say, public health. Like right now, there's a secret epidemic of Ebola that's spreading around the world, and they're trying to keep it hidden. And the CDC and all of these institutions that should be protecting and creating conditions of quarantine, etc., are simply hiding it because they can't handle it. They know that they are actually even responsible for it, and that they have no means of preventing the panic that will destroy the system by showing that it is unable to deal with the problems that it itself has created. And so that's just one of almost an endless list of problems self-created by the system's own desire to use bioweapons of disease and weapons of every sort that are all completely immoral toward the hegemonic control of the world, that are now backlashing against their employers. And so the system can't admit its own guilt in this rupture of the capacity to sustain order.
Yes, so it seems like at all levels, even people who's very conscious, supposedly that they're in paralysis, but they can see the whole mess right now. Like
some can.
Journalists and I think in the climate change world or whatever, like
sure.
The disclosure has been more.
Yeah, but they're still not allowed to admit it, you see.
But they see it, like they see
some do.
The whole mess, but there's no what to do, like the paralysis you were talking yesterday. But it seems like that connection is being made, like everyone is realizing of the mess at some level, somehow.
Sure.
My phone listens to me and just gives me the articles of the people that is waking up to these things, so I never know what's really happening.
Sure.
But so that capacity to see, but incapacity to respond to that wholeness that they can see, or that connection. And I can feel it sometimes, not here, because you show us the exit in a way, or the way out to that mess, but that feeling of paralysis is a vision and paralysis at the same time. How to, and they're like, what to do? Like, that's the question, what to do?
Right.
Well, they know that anything they do is impossible to fix the mess.
From the ego level, it can't be fixed.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, but what is going to happen next?
Well, I think the higher level of consciousness that can solve the problem will reveal itself ever more as the only oasis of sanity and empowerment and survivability that will then create new centers of power that are completely separate from the current centers that are collapsing. And that will bring a shift into a new world order of a kind that is not foreseen by the current forces that want to maintain power, because all of the present fictions upon which their power is based are losing their credibility and their attraction to the people who recognize that the financial system and the other systems have no inherent value. And so everyone's looking for what actually has real value, what has the ability to sustain life when all of the other things we've depended on have failed. And that's what is about to be revealed.
You talked about the quantum physics as an opening for change. What about the study of the brain and the meditation by the neurologist?
Yeah, unfortunately, they still want to believe that the brain generates consciousness. And so they are actually, I think, an obstacle toward understanding consciousness, because consciousness has nothing to do with the brain except that the brain functions as a transceiver of consciousness. It functions as the same way as a radio. But your radio doesn't create the programs that you can tune into. They come through waves from somewhere else. where do the brain waves actually originate? The mind waves, not just the localized brain waves that are produced by the neurons, because they are at the effect, but the waves that they can't actually perceive yet, because they don't have the technology for that, that actually bring consciousness into the body and control what happens, that the brain and the ego mind have no understanding of or control of. These higher forces of consciousness that are not brain-based are completely beyond the neurologist's ability to understand. And because they are stuck on this belief that we have to understand the neurological, let's say, map of the brain, as if that's where the power of consciousness is generated, that's a dead end, and they'll never find what they're looking for. It would be in the same way that you feel your computer and where is it hot to figure out, okay, where is the operating system, functioning. It's not about the hardware, and it's not even about the software of the ego structure that psychoanalysis is looking at, but it's about an entirely different level of consciousness in which the body is an appearance within thought. You see, they can't comprehend the fact that we are all living within a dream that's being produced by a consciousness that's so far beyond anything that appears within it, that we have to totally surrender to this consciousness that's transcendent of the world and dreaming us into this situation in which we think we have to solve a problem. But it's all part of God's sense of humor. And once
they can observe it, they can't measure it, so it doesn't exist for them.
No, and they can't solve the problem of how does consciousness emerge out of matter. But it doesn't emerge out of matter. Matter is simply an artifact of consciousness itself, but not an individual consciousness. It's a consciousness of cosmic dimensions.
I see what you mean by Ramana's charitra being reflected in the world in terms of the philosophies or the philosophy of materialism that's governed the world view being broken down. But at the same time, it seems like what we're seeing in culture is an ever more narcissistic, imaginary, autistic culture developing at the same time. So with a psychological level of maturity that's dropping lower and lower and lower, how will people, even if let's say the wider social philosophies are shifting, how will people who are at that stage of total psychological immaturity, attention deficit, all of these sorts of things be able to metabolize that?
Because, you see, they're in a state of collapse. They can't function. If they were successful in being able to lead imaginary lives as the puer aeternus and get away with a Peter Pan existence, then nothing would change. But they can't anymore. They're in a state of collapse. They're in a state of massive addiction and the use of opioids and all of this, because they're in a total meltdown and a nightmare of a failure. And it's because of that. And the system can't help them. The psychiatric system can't help them, the political system, social system. Nothing is of use. And so once a power comes that will enable them to dissolve the ego structure in which they are held in bondage, can have sufficient power because of its vibrational frequency that transmits a coherence that literally shifts morphogenetically the content of their consciousness so that they can download into the brain a new level of being. This is what's going to make the change happen. But it's literally a question of the amount of force that can be conveyed that can overcome the resistance of the egos that are in a state of collapse. And still resistance, but a resistance that no longer has the force to hold back the force of a higher consciousness that is going to overwhelm it. So this is where the will to power actually is going to prove, its ultimate relevance, but it's going to be the power of God that forces its way into the consciousness of those beings who will remain. There'll be a very small population on the earth soon. So we're going to have a totally different context in which this transformation from one age to another takes place. But it will take place effortlessly because that force of the supreme power is going to make the transformation happen. It's not something that's going to happen on an individual, we've got to do something about this kind of level. But literally a cosmic shift. Okay. Mm-hmm.
This will to power is bringing to mind the along with the Epistemophilia and even the ontology, that I'm ever more cognizant that in our satsangs, here especially, it's almost as if there could be a dog barking and speaking, because what is being I perceive more than even what is being said in the wisdom is waves of the energy that are very unique to the setting. They don't come in when I'm sitting and chanting Ilaya, but especially in the satsangs, there's such force, and it's undeniable. The waves that being received and obviously being transmitted through our gathering here. But what you are saying and what you say and all the wisdom that does return to this mind often in meditations and throughout the day is being what's being activated seems to be so much more subtle, and waves of energy is the best I can relate as you spoke. And when you're giving this description just now to Purusha about what makes the shifts, this invisible force, this power, is I don't know. Is this what perhaps I'm trying to describe? That's being transmitted to us all.
Yes, that's right. And it's the force that is what counts. If the force isn't with you, then the symbolic knowledge is of no value. And that's why this kind of conversation even is of very limited value, except for the fact that its backdrop is, as you say, the real energy, that this is only in a way disguising and allowing to move under the radar of the conversation on a symbolic level. But this is real, and it's real 3 that's moving through real 1, that's shifting the context of existence and opening the heart and bringing one into a state of surrealistic, uncanny recognition of something happening that Mr. Jones can't understand, So it's that, the fulfillment of everything that was foreseen already in the 60s, but that couldn't be conveyed and that couldn't be grasped simply through an acid trip, but that is so far beyond anything that the consciousness can conceptualize, that it just blows away the whole structure of the logic of the ego and enables that power to take over the mind. So that's what's happening. And it will happen in the beginning just in these oases of vibrational frequency, of communities like this. But as their power grows, they will become hubs of a network and a grid of consciousness that's of planetary and interplanetary dimensionality. And that will soon have no interest in even in relating to the formal centers of power that are in collapse. They will have to come here. We won't have to go there and beg for an audience. It will be a whole different level of a hierarchy of intelligence that'll be operating, but in a non-egoic format that will enable everyone to feel safe and secure in a surrender to a legitimacy of authority that is cosmic and transcosmic in nature. So it's this that will bring about a shift of loyalties that otherwise the ego could never accept or commit to wanting to receive a dispensation of intelligence and power and energy that would enable a transformation to take place that will dissolve the ego. But that's what is the passport into this new order and what will be required of everyone. Okay, how many people found this useful? Yeah? How many would like me to continue with this madness and develop it even further? Because there's a lot more, but thank you. Not everyone is open to having their minds blown away by information that won't fit into any ordinary paradigm of reality. But this is where the world is heading, and I'm just an instrument acting in accordance with my own orders to share what has been received. So thank you all for being willing to participate in going beyond the bounds of accepted reality and daring the frontiers of madness to discover transcendental wisdom and empowerment. Namaste.